Donald Trump's policies on the Middle East. What will the new US president do about the war in Syria? Getting rid of ISIL, what's his plan? And will he really scrap the Iran nuclear deal? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, love him or hate him, the right choice or not, Donald Trump will be the next president of the most powerful nation on earth. It's a reality that Americans who didn't vote for him, and indeed the rest of the world, will just have to get used to. So we ask, what will be his approach to the most volatile region, the Middle East? Does bombing the hell out of ISIS, as he promised, mean a more active role for the US military in the region? He's criticised Hillary Clinton and President Obama for mishandling the civil war in Syria. So what will he do differently? And what about the deal he describes as the worst ever? Does he plan to slap sanctions back on Iran? All right, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we have J.D. Gordon, National Security and Foreign Policy Advisor to Donald Trump. In Beirut, Maha Yahya, Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. And here in Doha with me, Samer Shahata, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. All right, let's start with ISIL. Now, Mr. Trump says the Obama administration has mishandled the fight in Iraq and Syria. The president-elect had this to say at a rally in September.
We're going to convene my top generals and give them a simple instruction. They will have 30 days to submit to the Oval Office a plan for soundly and quickly defeating ISIS.
All right, J.D. Gordon in Washington. So Mr. Trump has vowed to crush and destroy ISIL. How's he going to do that?
Hello, Martine. Great to see you. Well, we have to use strength, first of all. I think that the Obama administration has really had a wishful thinking strategy in defeating the Islamic State, and Mr. Trump will use more force in terms of, at least, I believe, the generals will submit a plan to him with increased use of air power. We have to do a lot more as far as bombing the actual targets. I mean, there are so many Islamic State targets that have been clearly within striking distance of our aircraft, but so many have returned with their bombs because of concern over environmental damage and absolute certainty that there are not going to be any civilian casualties. Well, I think Mr. Trump is going to be a lot tougher in fighting the Islamic State militarily, and also he's going to squeeze them more economically.
So would that mean that the presence of civilians and indeed environmental damage would matter much less to Mr. Trump?
Yeah, I mean, the priority for Mr. Trump is to wipe out the Islamic State. And so you have to use force to do that, and you have to use economic pressure as well. The Obama administration has done some of that, but it's been far too little. We also have to rely a lot more on our allies, as Mr. Trump has said. He wants Saudi Arabia and our Gulf state allies to get much more involved in this fight, and they should.
Maha, coming to you in Beirut, what do you make of that? What does that sound like to you as a strategy for dealing with what is possibly one of the biggest threats of our time?
I think, hello Martine, I think it's a misguided strategy to some extent. You can bomb all that you want, that will not get rid of ISIS. And if the US starts bombing indiscriminately without any concern for the loss of civilian lives, then this is going to increase the anger in the region and across the world against the United States, against its allies, and probably increase levels of radicalization amongst communities that are not necessarily radicalized at this point. Getting rid of ISIS is not just about a military mindset. It's also about looking at the root causes that led to ISIS. It's about working with the Iraqi government to have a more inclusive, participatory political process. And so on and so forth. So a military campaign, or looking at this simply from a military perspective, will just not do it. On the contrary, it's going to increase the threat of radicalization and terrorism across the globe.
And Samer here in the studio, if indeed Mr. Trump does pursue this crush and destroy militaristic policy against ISIL, would he find himself in the position perhaps of being the marshal-in-chief, if you like, of attracting more and more those joining up with these groups that espouse violence?
Well, I agree with Meha's assessment. I think there's no question that if there is a kind of indiscriminate use of force, if there is kind of unbridled bombing and significant numbers of civilian casualties, as we've seen elsewhere in Afghanistan and so on, this is an excellent recruiting tool, in addition to the fact that people who are the victims will want to somehow become involved or seek revenge and so on. There is not a purely military solution to this. I think it's important, however, to say firstly, that we simply also just don't know what Mr. Trump is going to do. I mean, he's made some very general statements and so on, but with regard to specifics, it's not going to be clear actually how he executes them. And we need to differentiate, I think, analytically between what's campaign rhetoric and what is policy. But there is one thing that I think is going to take place, which is he has repeatedly said that ISIS is the enemy and the Assad regime is not. And he's also talked about bettering or strengthening relations with Russia because we have a mutual enemy there. And so I think we will see some direct implications of both of those statements.
Okay, well, we'll come to Syria explicitly in a moment. JD, coming back to you in Washington, what are the president-elect's thought about the deeper, more nuanced causes as to the rise of ISIL and of the strength of ISIL? And I know that on the campaign trail, he's blamed the existence of ISIL on both President Obama and Hillary Clinton. But can we dismiss that as campaign rhetoric?
Well, you know, I've talked to him about this, and he understands that a major cause of the conflict right now is the Saudi-Iranian conflict, the contest for the Shia crescent, if you will, the battle that's been going on for decades, really, between the Sunni extremists on one hand and the Shia extremists on the other. And when you take out the strongman dictators like Saddam Hussein and marginalized guys like Bashar al-Assad, you open a Pandora's box where there's just complete chaos and a complete breakdown of countries like we've seen in Iraq and Syria. But getting back to what the other guests have said, I agree with some of the things they did say. Of course, you have to have a political solution. You have to solve the root causes, and you can't just solve it with military and economic solutions. It's an ideology you have to defeat, and also a territorial issue you have to solve for autonomy, for groups to vote for who they want to have represent them and not be predatory like they are, unfortunately, like the leaders have been in Syria and Iraq. However, about the bombing, Mr. Trump hasn't talked about indiscriminate bombing. I mean, that is a straw man argument people attribute to him falsely. He just doesn't want a weak strategy like Obama has. What is the line we have to cross when it comes to how many, what type of risks you're going to take in bombing Islamic State military targets and fighters? President Obama has acted like the president of Amnesty International in not wanting any civilian casualties at all, and that's just not really a realistic way to defeat a terror enemy that's embedded.
JD, can I just put to you what is on the ISIL website, and this is a rough translation. The world is going to experience a change, and this change will put Islam in the leadership position as the end result, and it predicts the end of the American empire. So the election of Mr. Trump as President of the United States is being welcomed. Long have they welcomed the prospect of military confrontation with the US, and it sounds very much as though that's the way you're going.
Well, the way I'm going is I think you have to pressure the leaders of Islam in Mecca to really try to do more to not just ideologically discredit the Islamic State, but actually do more physically to wipe them out. I mean, if you're going to have boots on the ground, they should be from the Saudis, of other Gulf states, Jordanians, Egyptians. You have to, if you have a ground force that takes on the Islamic State, which they're Sunnis, you have to have them from Sunni countries. We can't have a situation where there's basically occupying forces, which I believe the Iraqi government is Shia-dominated. It is an Iranian puppet. The Syrian government is also an Iranian puppet. So I think that you have to have a Sunni force that goes to retake those areas physically, because we're seeing civilians being slaughtered right now in Iraq from Iraqi-backed forces.
Okay.
And so that situation cannot stand.
All right, let's move on to the next specific subject. And of course, the fight against ISIL is very much connected to the war in Syria and indeed the future of President Assad. This is what Mr. Trump says.
We're backing rebels. We don't know who the rebels are. We're giving them lots of money, lots of everything. We don't know who the rebels are. But if they ever did overthrow Assad, you might end up with as bad as Assad is, and he's a bad guy. But you may very well end up with worse than Assad.
And Maha, let's come to you. Now, Mr. Trump has talked about building a free zone in Syria, paid for by the Gulf states, among others. And as Sameh has already pointed out, he seems to be pretty much in approval of the continuation of rule by President Assad. Is that going to help matters?
Absolutely not. I mean, just to put things a bit in perspective, the polarization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the rise in radicalism, did not happen because you removed the strongman, i.e. Saddam Hussein, for example. It happened because of the strongmen, because of the way they clamped down on liberties, on participation. I mean, the fundamental issue has been the way these men ruled these countries over decades, which created marginalization, exclusion, and resentment. Boots on the ground, there already are boots on the ground fighting ISIS in Iraq, and they are Sunni and Shia boots on the ground. These are Iraqi forces that are fighting ISIS, and they are now surrounding, with the support of the US and other allies, to try and retake Mosul, and the same in Raqqa in Syria. So maintaining someone like Assad in Syria and saying that removing him, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know, I think is a mistaken argument, because this will not lead towards any kind of sustainable peace. It will not remove the headache, and actually it's going to be fodder for further radicalization, potentially more conflict in the region that will not stay, as we've seen. It will not be contained to the region. It's going to spread far beyond it.
Let's move on to Sameh and say, from what you've heard, is Donald Trump likely to be an interventionist or an isolationist, particularly when it comes to Syria?
Right. Well, we've heard a lot of neo-isolationist discourse from Mr. Trump. He does not believe that it's the United States' role to be the policeman of the world and so on. But to kind of get back to, and it's related to this, what Maha said, and to extend it a little bit, it relates to Syria. I think it's very important. I think one cannot escape the conclusion that the #1 problem in the region is authoritarianism. You can call it bad governance, you can call it lack of freedom, lack of democracy, and so on. And this doesn't explain everything in the region, but it is the primary cause of what is happening and has happened in Iraq and in Syria. Getting it to Syria, what that means is that Bashar al-Assad is the flip side of ISIS. In other words, there's no way to deal with ISIS without dealing with the industrial killing machine of Bashar al-Assad. So having an approach, as Donald Trump has said, that, oh, ISIS is enemy #1, we need to deal with him only, and I can live with Bashar al-Assad and so on, that is not a solution by any stretch of the imagination. Bashar al-Assad cultivates more recruits than ISIS, than anything that we know of.
And so, JD in Washington, are you saying that Mr. Trump is likely to increase US military intervention in Syria or step back still further?
Martine, I think that he would have increased airstrikes. Basically, he's talked about that. But I don't think you would see any type of major U.S. ground presence there. Maha had mentioned ground troops in Iraq. Yes, the U.S. has about 5,000 there, and we have some special forces in Syria. I don't really think you'd see that increase. I think Mr. Trump will be pressing for our Arab allies to have more boots on the ground and take a heavier role.
Okay.
But your guest in Doha was right about one thing I wanted to mention, which is cooperation with Russia. Mr. Trump wants better cooperation with Russia, and as we know, the Russians want to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. Whether Bashar al-Assad can retake the rest of Syria, I tend to doubt. I think you need a political solution where there's autonomy for different groups around the country of Syria, but I think that Bashar al-Assad will remain in control of at least part of what's on the map for Syria.
JD, still with you. Mr. Trump has also suggested that Russia's campaign in Syria is merely directed against ISIL, and clearly that's not the fact. Has he got a full understanding of events on the ground in Syria, in particular right now Aleppo?
He's getting up to speed on those issues right now as we speak.
Maha, what do you think, closer cooperation between the US administration and the Russian administration, what do you think that will deliver to Syria? Will that deliver peace for Syrians?
Depends on what kind of cooperation, on what terms. Already there's a lot of cooperation in military terms. There were at one point joint flights. I mean, actually, for many Syrians in the opposition, they felt that the US was already subcontracting Syria to some extent to the Russians. So I think it depends on the terms of the cooperation. If they continue along the current lines, then no, this will not deliver peace. If we see a move into balancing the playing field a little bit more, working on, I mean, just stop focusing on Bashar al-Assad only and actually look at the governance setup in Syria. What should the relationship be between the center and the peripheries? I disagree that giving autonomy to different groups is going to resolve this. Syrians are not asking for a federal system based on ethnic and sectarian identities. We already tried that in Iraq to some extent, and it only brought further chaos. People don't think of themselves in those terms. Despite in Syria 5 years of bloody conflict, they still don't think of themselves, the majority, in those terms. They want to see a Syria where they do have a say in the running of their own affairs on a daily basis. So I think rethinking the relationship of the center to the periphery, rethinking of the kind of powers that rest with the presidency, these are the issues that should be on the table today. And this is somewhere a place where, yes, the Russians and the Americans can cooperate if there is an interest in looking at a long-term sustainable solution for Syria. If there isn't, then we're looking at a stalemate and continued conflict and increasing radicalization. The more this continues, the worse it's becoming for all of us.
Okay.
What could have been done 5 years ago is no longer possible today.
OK, let's move on then to the next subject. Now, Mr. Trump has repeatedly described the Iran nuclear deal as the worst ever negotiated. Here's what he had to say at the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or the AIPAC, in March.
My number one priority is to dismantle the disastrous deal with Iran. This deal is catastrophic for America, for Israel, and for the whole of the Middle East.
So, JD, I have to come back to you and say, well, what exactly is his intention? Is he going to rip it up, tear it to shreds completely, or is he going to renegotiate it, or is he going to implement it more fiercely? What exactly is the policy on this?
Well, Mr. Trump said many times that he plans to renegotiate that deal because it's the worst deal in history. Basically, any type of renegotiation has to take a look at the enrichment of uranium. Any country that can enrich uranium can develop nuclear weapons. There are dozens of countries that have nuclear power, dozens of them, but only 13 enrich uranium. All of those 13 either have nuclear weapons or are covered by the U.S. nuclear umbrella, 3 of them, and Iran. So basically, Iran wants to enrich uranium to develop nuclear weapons, and Mr. Trump has to renegotiate it so that they cannot enrich uranium. There are 6 UN Security Council resolutions against enriching uranium. So Mr. Trump has to force the system to go back to the drawing board and make sure they cannot enrich uranium.
And Summer here in Doha with me. I mean, this is the signature policy of the Obama administration, isn't it? The Iran nuclear deal with the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. This has been trumpeted as a major, significant victory for peace generally in the region. What do you think of the plans then to renegotiate, as JD is saying?
Well, I think to a large extent it's not going to be looked on favorably by our European allies. I think we've already seen that. And I think it's going to give Iran an excuse, actually, also to potentially walk away from any kind of restrictions or limitations on enriching uranium and the development of nuclear technology in the future. They'll say that the United States didn't live up to its bargain already made and so on, and therefore this allows us to go forward. So, it's very worrying, I have to say. And I think we also have to remember what the situation was without the deal several years ago. We've forgotten that. And And that situation was the possibility of Israel, for example, striking Iran, as they did in the early 1980s against the Iraqi nuclear program. That would lead to a larger problem, I think, region-wide and so on. So I think that hopefully Mr. Trump will reconsider and will stick to one of his earlier statements, which was, a strict enforcement as opposed to tearing the deal up or trying to renegotiate.
And Maha in Beirut, the election of Mr. Trump was music to the ears of Mr. Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, wasn't it? They were clamouring almost to congratulate him, and they see this as possibly being the end, crushing perhaps the possibility of a two-state solution for the Palestinians.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're looking at, Mr. Trump has promised to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he has promised to acknowledge Jerusalem as, or at least to consider Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. If he were to do those things, it's not the first time that a president it's not the first time that this has been promised during an electoral campaign. However, we have to wait and see whether he is going to carry out those promises. If he does do that, I think this will create chaos. We're looking probably or possibly at a third intifada, but I think it's going to disrupt the US's relationships with a broad range of allies in the region and far beyond.
So, JD, if Mr. Trump carries out his words of moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, he considers occupation of the West Bank settlement not to be occupation at all. He's encouraging settlement buildings. What do you think his likely reaction or his tactic, his strategy would be to the prospect of a third intifada?
Well, clearly he would not welcome that. None of us would. But he understands that when it comes down to Israel and the Palestinians have always walked away from a deal at the end of the day for decades. And so he believes that we ought to have a long-term solution. But both sides have to be able to compromise. The Palestinians have always refused things like on the right of return. They want the right of return, which means that Israel would not exist as a Jewish state anymore, a Jewish majority state anymore. And also, more importantly, for security, the Palestinians have refused to allow an Israeli military contingent in the Jordan River Valley. And if you don't do that, it'd be suicide for Israel to have a two-state solution if you don't have troops there, because should the Jordan government change someday, and hopefully it doesn't change to be anti-Israel. Right now it's pro-Israel, supportive of Israel. If, God forbid, the Jordan government becomes hostile, giving the West Bank to the Palestinians would be suicide for Israel if they didn't have troops along that Jordan River Valley. So the Palestinians haven't compromised enough. Mr. Trump gets that.
Samir, coming to you, we haven't got much time left on the programme, but it sounds very much from what we've heard that Mr. Trump is pursuing continuation of the status quo, perhaps not coming with any new thinking that might actually alter some of these intractable conflicts that we've been discussing today? Well,
I think, unfortunately, as we've heard, it's much worse than the status quo. I mean, I wish it was just a continuation of the bad already status quo. But, even more, greater support for Israel, colonization of the West Bank and so on, annexation, as it were. This is likely to lead to kind of more intense conflict in the region, whether it's another intifada or continued support for authoritarian regimes, and we've seen it already in his statements and so on. So one has to be quite, skeptical, I think, unfortunately, of what the future holds.
And of course, we haven't seen the complexion of the Trump administration. But for now, I'm afraid we have to end it. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us for this romp through potential Middle East foreign policy of a President Trump. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com, of course. If you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team, it's bye for now.